Dr. Gracia Villarroel is an associate professor of political science and the director of the International Studies program at the Norbert College. She is a scholar of comparative politics and international relations, with expertise in Latin America political movements and democratic transitions. From 2007 to 2008, she served as a Santo Domingo Fellow at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard, where she conducted research on indigenous politics and international institutions. From 2014 to 2017, Dr. Villarroel served as Associate Academic Dean for Global Affairs, where she created institutional partnerships across Europe, Latin America, and Asia, strengthened international student support, and developed a centralized structure for global seminars. She has served on the executive board of the International Studies Association Peace Studies section and was co-editor of LASA Forum, the journal of the Latin American Studies Association. Dr. Villarroel founded and directed the St. Norbert College United Nations seminar, which ran for over 2 decades at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Through this program, over 100 SNC students engaged directly with diplomats, United Nations staff, and heads of state at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. Her peer-reviewed scholarship focuses on democratic movements, political transitions, governance, and civic participation in Latin America. She is very active and serves on various boards, including Envision Greater Green Bay, the YMCA, and an advisory group to the Green Bay Police Department. She previously served as the president of the board of Casa Alba Melanie, the Hispanic Resource Center of Brown County. For her leadership and commitment to equity, Dr. Villarroel has been recognized with several prestigious awards, including the 2020 St. Norbert College Founders Award, the 2024 Madison 365 Woman of Excellence Award, and the 2024 Board Award for Community Involvement. Please join me in welcoming our speaker to the podium.
I want to thank Father Anwu, first of all, for the really nice introduction, and thank all of you for being here tonight. I want to thank our president, Dr. Lori Joyner, she's here somewhere, Dr. Valerie Martin Conley, Dr. Bola Delano, Dr. David Curry, and UWGB as well for sponsoring the Great Decision series and also this lecture. I really greatly appreciate your support. This evening, I'm sorry, I'm going to put the, I'm going to actually put the, what I'm going to be talking about. So I have it up there, and I'm mostly going to be reading this lecture, but I have the format that I'll be following so you can follow as I go. This evening holds quiet but profound weight. We are living through moments of systemic and geopolitical transformation, ones that cannot fully be captured tonight by an outline in this presentation. We are witnessing the slow but certain evolution of the international system and the global economy. an economy increasingly defined not by dominance of one superpower, but by the interplay of multiple centers of influence, by new technologies, shifting labor flows, and emerging ideologies. The role of the United States within this changing landscape is no longer assured nor static. It is being redefined in real time. Once the uncontested leader of liberal economic globalization, the US now finds itself navigating a world of competing visions of state-led capitalism, digital mercantilism, and rising regional blocs. This is not the start of an entirely new story, but rather a familiar arc in a longer narrative, a recurring moment in which nations recalibrate, powers shift, and systems evolve. I am a political scientist, so I understand the recalibration that happens at different moments in history. And though we cannot grasp every detail tonight, we can pause and reflect on the contours of this transformation, on its implications for leadership, for global order, and for the soul of the economy itself. Since we are talking about economics and world powers, I begin fittingly in the spirit of our namesake, Saint Norbert of Santon. His life speaks with unmistakable clarity to the sacred responsibility of leadership. In a time fractured by vanity and division, Norbert stood for reform, for humility in service, for truth pursued with both courage and reverence. To his priests, he offered not a command, but a calling. You are not yourself because you are a servant and a minister of Christ. You are not yourself because you are a mediator between God and man. In these words, we glimpse a theology of leadership, not as dominion, but as devotion. A reminder that power, rightly held, must bend toward service. I speak to you not as an economist, though I will borrow the economist lens tonight, but as a political scientist, and more specifically, as a Latina political scientist. Because this is a perspective, everybody has a perspective. It is not a footnote to understanding. Perspective is a foundation. I often tell my students that perspective matters. You don't have to agree with every viewpoint you encounter. You certainly don't have to agree with my viewpoint tonight. But it's good to listen genuinely and openly to perspectives that are not your own. That is how learning begins, and tonight I say the same to you. The likelihood that you would hear a Latina scholar at a Great Decisions series is incredibly small. Only about 1% of Latinas in the US hold a PhD. I say this only to underscore that you would probably not hear this perspective, typically. But it is not marginal because of that. It's part of the larger story of the Global South. It may be unfamiliar to some, but it is real and it matters, especially when talking about US leadership in US economic leadership in world politics. Though my field is in fact US foreign policy, I have chosen to narrow the lens to focus on the economic systems that have shaped and continue to shape the soul of this country. For it is in the structures of production and exchange, in the policies we normalize, and in the stories we tell ourselves about markets and value that the deeper moral direction of a nation is often revealed. This evening, I will provide some added context to Daniel Dresner's article that you've read in your booklet. My aim is to walk you through the evolution of US economic systems, how they developed over time, and what they reveal about our underlying values, and what they suggest about the moral condition and the US economic leadership as we move further into the 21st century. Together, we will trace the shifting role of the US in the global economy, from the Hamiltonian beginnings through the Bretton Woods era, to the rise of neoliberal orthodoxy, to the current resurgence of neo-mercantilism, what Dresner calls post-neoliberalism. But we will do so with a deeper question always in view, not just what has happened, but what kind of a world are we making? Because I was formed by the rich humanistic education of the Maryknoll brothers and sisters during my high school years in Bolivia, and later by the Jesuits in the historic University of San Francisco Javier de Chuquisaca, founded in 1624. This talk weaves together threads of political economy, the Catholic social teaching they instilled in me, and the stirring words of popes and prophets who remind us that an economy is never merely a system. It is a moral mirror revealing to who we believe ourselves to be in relation to one another. So I'll start with this first section, our mercantilist past. Many are surprised to see President Donald Trump so openly shun the post-World War II liberal economic order, as if it emerged out of nowhere, an exception to the American tradition. But in truth, President Trump is not a rupture. He is a product of his era and the inheritor of a long-standing tradition of economic nationalism that stretches back to the founding of the Republic. To understand where we stand today, we must begin with the so-called liberal order. We cannot start with the liberal order. We must return to the early days of American statecraft, when economy was not a machine, but a means of survival and sovereignty. Long before globalization promised a seamless flow of capital and labor, the American project was grounded in a profoundly nationalist economic vision. Let us begin with the American origin story, not the myth of rugged individualism, but the mercantile roots that shaped this nation's economic soul. It is often said that the invisible hand of the market guides us towards a collective good. But Adam Smith, who's so often reduced to that single metaphor, was also a moral philosopher. His theory of moral sentiments of 1759 reminded us that no economy can survive without empathy, without what he called fellow feeling. Smith believed in markets, yes, but never without morality. The US, from its inception, seemed to understand this, or at least its architects understood that central paradox, that a young, fragile republic could not afford to trust entirely in free trade, not when surrounded by empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, not when its own industries were in their infancy. Alexander Hamilton was ahead of his time. When he submitted his Report of Manufacturers to Congress on December 5th, 1791, as the first Secretary of the Treasury under President George Bush, the Industrial Revolution was still at its infancy in Great Britain. Yet Hamilton had already crafted a bold economic vision for the young United States, one that anticipated the transformative power of industry and the need for a strong national economic strategy. Hamilton's proposal was neither laissez-faire nor rooted in agrarian self-sufficiency. Instead, it was deeply pragmatic, what we might now describe as neo-mercantilist in tone. He believed the federal government had a responsibility to actively support and shape the economy, not out of fear of protectionism, but out of foresight and prudence. In his report, Hamilton laid out a comprehensive plan to diversify the American economy beyond agriculture and reduce its dependence on imported goods. His recommendations included protective tariffs on foreign goods to shield emerging American industries from overseas competition during their formative years. It also included government subsidies or bounties to support domestic manufacturers and stimulate industrial innovation. Hamilton did not worship the market, he wielded it. His aim was to build an economically self-reliant citizenry, free not only from the British political rule, but also from the reliance on British goods. For Hamilton, true independence required industrial strength and demanded a national economic plan rooted in vision, strategy, and statecraft. That same insight would resonate more than 2 centuries later in the work of South Korean economist Ha-Joon Chang in his influential book, Kicking Away the Ladder. Chang argues that the very countries that now advocate for open markets and free trade, countries like Britain and the United States, first rose to power through the very kinds of protectionist policies Hamilton championed. Only after securing their economic dominance did they begin to kick away the ladder, pressuring developing nations to ascend without tools they themselves had used. South Korea, Chang's own homeland, stands as a living testament to this truth. Emerging from war and devastation in the mid-20th century, it rejected the prescription of pure market liberalism. Instead, it followed a deliberate national plan, investing in education, shielding key industries, and fostering homegrown innovation. The result is a thriving, globally competitive economy, built not by surrendering to the market, but by shaping it. Like Hamilton, South Korea understood that economic independence is not a given. It is built carefully and intentionally through policies that serve the public good and protect national dignity. In both cases, we see that behind every prosperous economy lies not just capital or trade, but true vision. Between Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers and Henry Clay's promotion of the American system beginning in 1816, we see a striking continuity. A belief that the US economy should not be left to chance, but strategically guided by the state. Clay, one of the most influential statesmen of the early 19th century, served as Speaker of the House and as Secretary of State, and used those platforms to advocate for protective tariffs, a national bank, and federal investment in infrastructure. His vision extended Hamilton's into the western frontier, arguing that canals, roads, and railroads could bind the republic together and create opportunity across class and region. Clay's economic philosophy, like Hamilton's, was rooted in neo-mercantilism, the belief that a nation must actively cultivate its industrial base through state intervention rather than relying on unregulated markets. Unlike classical mercantilism of the 16th and 18th centuries, which sought to hoard gold and extract resources through colonial empire, this new form prioritized national development, internal cohesion, and industrial self-reliance. It was not about empire, it was about nationhood, nation states. Clay understood that true independence required more than political sovereignty. It demanded economic capacity and resilience. But we must also recognize that what this pursuit of economic strength meant in practice. As the US expanded its infrastructure and industrial base, it simultaneously entrenched a colonial hierarchy within its borders. The very canals and railroads that symbolized mobility and opportunity for white Americans were built across native lands, financed through systems that depended on Black labor and extended into territories that once belonged to Mexico and indigenous peoples. The economic ascent of the US as a continental power came at a cost to others. It would take centuries before, as a community, we recognized that this is exactly what we did, as we read this evening, the land acknowledgement statement that we heard earlier. While Clay's policies primarily served white male property owners, his legacy reveals something important. Even in these early years, the promises of the young American Republic excluded the non-Western world and underrepresented minorities, including white women. The vision of unity and mobility was real, but it was partial. And yet Clay remained steadfast in his pursuit of national cohesion. His example reminds us that the economy has always been more than numbers and trade. It is a moral project, capable of knitting people together or pulling them apart. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Catholic Church was entering its own reckoning with modernity. The ravages of the Industrial Revolution, the tenement, the sweatshop, the child laborer, had begun to stain the moral fabric of Europe. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII issued Rerum Novarum, the Church's first systematic response to modern capitalism. It was a revolutionary document in its own right, affirming the dignity of work, the rights of laborers, and the duties of capital. It denounced cruelty of unregulated markets while also warning against the loss of individual freedom under socialism. At its heart, Rerum Novarum asked a timeless question: what is the economy for? And the answer was clear: not for the accumulation of capital, but for the flourishing of the human person. This Catholic critique, this theology of work, wages, and worth, would continue to evolve, providing a moral counterweight to the rising tide of economic liberalism in the 20th century. So now we move into the Bretton Woods era. The Second World War had not yet concluded when delegates from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in a moment of extraordinary vision shaped by the devastation of the two world wars and guided by pragmatism. They sought to design a new global economic framework. The goals were clear: stabilize currencies, prevent future depressions, and reduce the risk of another global conflict. Bretton Woods was more than a technocratic exercise in monetary coordination. It was, in essence, a moral and political response to the failure of interwar capitalism. The leading architects, John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, recognized that unregulated markets contributed to global instability in the 1930s. The system they devised was not utopian, but practical, a rule-based framework led by the United States intended to embed markets within broader social and political goals. What is important to note is that it was laid by us, by the United States. This new international system chain reaction of job losses, foreclosures, and shattered trust. The state intervened to save the very financial institutions that had caused the crisis, while millions of ordinary people in the US were left behind. Movements like Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party arose in direct response to this rupture. Trust in elites, institutions, and the post-war economic order had collapsed. The crisis exposed a system that no longer served the people it claimed to uplift, and it planted the seeds of the next chapter, one marked not by reform, but by revolt. Okay, to the fifth section. By 2016, the architecture of the global economy stood intact, but its foundations had cracked. The liberal order was no longer trusted. Into this atmosphere of disillusionment and retreat stepped Donald J. Trump, not merely as a political figure, but as a symbolic force. He was not an anomaly, but the outcome of a nation grappling with abandonment, inequality, and a sense of betrayal. The aftershocks of the 2008 financial crisis had hollowed out communities, stagnated wages, and deepened inequities. People turned inward. They sought protection in the familiar symbol of the nation, not in the open marketplace, not in globalization. The nation state became a shield. President Trump's economic worldview revived older American traditions, Hamiltonian, protectionist, and transactional, but it was unapologetically blunt. America First was not just a slogan, it was reframing the national purpose. In place of global cooperation, he favored bilateral treaties. In place of comparative advantage, he reinstated tariffs. Multilateralism and liberal norms gave way to neo-mercantilism, state-led, interest-driven, and power-focused. Yet President Trump's neo-mercantilism was often more rhetorical than structural, and we yet have to see how it will all evolve in the years to come. Meanwhile, China advanced with long-term strategic initiatives, notably the Belt and Road Initiative, projecting a vision of global connectivity and investment as the US turned inward. China's global engagement stood in sharp contrast, signaling a shift in global influence and credibility. Trumpism signaled a broader global pattern. From India to Hungary to Brazil to the UK, economic nationalism had surged. Multilateralism faltered. Even in the European Union, had to contend with growing internal pressures. The post-war consensus lost moral authority. National sovereignty returned not as a regression, but as a reassertion of control and self-determination. Yet this shift came with a cost: diminished cooperation, weakened global norms, and increased fragmentation. The focus on the national interest often ignored global responsibility. Dresner offers us four futures about where we go from here. Each possibility maps a landscape shaped by power, distrust, and competition. Each attempts to make sense of the post-war neoliberal world, the post-neoliberal world or neo-mercantilist world. And yet I find myself wondering, not just as a political scientist, but as someone who was deeply shaped by the Catholic social teaching and the Norbertine tradition, are these the only futures we can imagine? Because from where we stand, from this place, from this college, from this faith, I believe we must ask different questions moving forward. What if we asked, who is our neighbor in the age of walls? What is our obligation in a world of fragmentation? What kind of economy restores rather than exploits? What kind of leadership is worthy of our children? Catholic social teaching has long insisted that economic policy is never morally neutral. It matters how we trade. It matters who we exclude. It matters who we lift up and who we leave behind. Solidarity is not a sentiment, it is an ethic. Subsidiarity is not a bureaucracy, it is a call to empower. And care is not weakness, it is wisdom. So tonight I offer a fifth future, not one rooted in realism or rivalry, but one rooted in responsibility. A future of moral globalism, a future where leadership is measured not by dominance, but by compassion. a future that begins not with the market, but with mercy. As a Latina political scientist, I know what it means to be told that your voice does not belong at the center of any conversation, and yet here I am, and here we are. And so I say that with all clarity, this is my final lecture at St. Norbert. We do belong, all of us belong, not just at the margins, but in the making of what comes next. The world we inhabit is fractured. Polarization will deepen. We have not seen yet where the US will go, but countries around the world are going to really change in this time of structural change. We have not seen the impact yet of artificial intelligence, automation, climate change, and decentralization. And nationalism will rise again. But that is precisely why the world needs a new moral economy, a new imagination, a new kind of way of looking at the world rooted not in fear but in fidelity. And if we think of where to begin, I am reminded of the words of St. Norbert. Be mindful of the poor, care for the weak, uphold the truth, and serve with joy. Let that joy be humble but real, and let it carry us into the future, one where we can imagine it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Villarroel.
Thank you.
Before I open the floor to questions, I want to say this. It will do us a lot of good if you can stick to the question, be very pointed, sharp, and short. If you do that, you will be doing this crowd a great favor. With that, I open the floor.
Thank you. I thought that was a very interesting and a wonderful talk. So thanks for bringing in your perspective of it and in all of these different stages. I did want to ask, though, in the third portion you have here of neoliberalism, or as you also referred to, globalization, one of the ideas behind globalization was that the more interrelated and more interdependent countries are, the less likely they are to go to war. So the European Union was created to try to diminish tensions between countries and to prevent a future war. And the idea of global trade and interdependence would reduce those types of conflicts. Do you think that a return to neo-mercantilism then will necessarily increase tensions and increase the likelihood for more global war and conflict?
I do agree with you, what you said about especially what we would call liberal internationalism, right? That is very much rooted in rules, international organizations like the European Union and like the order that the United Nations has been trying to create. There is a lot of value in what they are doing, but I think right now, in this moment in time, countries are turning inward, and if you think of international relations, they're turning more realist. And that is what we're seeing with the US. I think the US is feeling more vulnerable because of all the factors that I mentioned earlier. And as the US feels more vulnerable, I think other countries will respond in a similar manner. And realism does tell us that countries tend to, always be focusing on their own national interest, which goes against that international liberal order that we had been seeing. So I think that we are at that stage. The question is, what can people in everyday life do about it? But the trends are there right now.
Yes, thank you for a really great talk. But I'm just wondering, is with our current government and the way things are going, with the future of faith, I'm not seeing any of this, and I'm very, very unoptimistic that any of this is going to happen. And do you see some major factor here that is going to change our isolationism and get us away from this? I think the wrong path.
I think that there are various factors that will probably have to help us rethink some of our policies. For one thing, it's the demographic decline, right? That we are seeing fertility rates decline, and every country will need people and need bodies. Already throughout the world, countries are in different cities are trying to attract young people by offering, thousands of dollars and houses and this and that. So I think one of the things that we will see is that before automation takes full course, which some people think would replace labor, we'll still need people. So I think that will be one way in which that happens. I think the other piece is that I think people in general, whether it's through religion or through moral, just their own morality, I think it's hard for people to see suffering, and so I think if people see a lot of suffering, they will start talking about that, right? If that would continue to happen, or if there are policies that can cause a lot of suffering. But I have to say, as I mentioned in my talk, that the US is not the only country that is going in that direction. It is a global trend, and it's happening all over the world, and it's happening, I would say, because a lot of people feel a very strong sense of identity as we are seeing the decentralization of everything, right? Decentralization of currency, decentralization of the media. So people feel like they need to grasp into something, and I think this is what we're seeing today. President Trump is responding to that need, and that is not just President Trump, it's happening in other parts of the world.
You started with the role of government.
Mhm.
How do you see the future? What is the purpose of government?
I think one of the things that we see with government a lot is definitely to serve the needs of its population. It's the social contract, right? The government has to serve the needs of its population. I think the biggest question that we have in the world that we're living in today is how do we define who needs to be served? How big, how small do we go? Because even the nation state itself is a political unit that is relatively new for a lot of people. I mean, the reason it works in the US is because we have a very strong nation-building system. Some of my students know that how do we make US citizens out of one generation being in the US? It's because we sing the national anthem, we do the Pledge of Allegiance in every game. We do a lot of things to create that sense of nation state. But I think the biggest question that we have is how big is our circle? Who's in and who's out? And I think that is what we will be grappling with in the 21st century. Because one thing that empires did is they included a lot of people that didn't have to have the same identity, right? They didn't have to have the same religion. And many people in my field of international relations have been talking already for a while about the post-Westphalian system, that the nation-state system is having trouble going on to the 21st century, mostly because it brings up the question of who is in and who is out. So I think government does the same thing, but question is who does it? Who's in and who's out? I think there's something there.
You raise a lot of good questions, but I'm wondering, are there any leaders any place that you notice that can speak to this in the future in any way?
To how the future will evolve?
Yes, and are there leaders like in some country or that have a pattern or thought?
I think right now, I will go back to the UN. I'm very familiar with the UN. I think the UN has a series of documents with international law that protects people in different ways, right? And it has, when I talk about how big our circle is, the UN circle is very big, especially the UN of the Secretariat. In all the years that I've gone to the United Nations, there are almost like two United Nations. One is the UN of the nation states or the countries, and then there's the Secretariat that has a very global vision. A lot of people who work with the UN, who work with international law, have developed all types of documents that protect people across the world, and people who absolutely believe that that is the way to go. I can't imagine that we will stop doing that. I can't imagine that the world will not continue to work on international law, that the world will not continue to try to work on helping refugees and doing all of those things. I think what we will see is that there will be a clash between nation states and countries trying to do this alone and then really facing global problems that cannot be resolved by countries alone.
We are doing very well with time. We have 4 more minutes, and we can take one more, and then we fold.
You talk about the different economic systems from Hamilton, up to the present, and then you get into the futures. You didn't mention democratic socialism. Do you see democratic socialism as one of the paths that would be consistent with Catholic moral values and the things that you talked about that motivate Catholic faith?
I think in many ways, democratic socialism is what some European countries have done, and also what you can see in Canada as well. And definitely it works. I think that in many global South countries, they're facing so many other issues that cannot necessarily be addressed just by democratic socialism, because the divide between the rich and the poor is so great that other things need to happen. I think a lot of global South countries believe that China had a solution, and that's why a lot of global South countries favor China, because they believe that China was able to get millions of people out of poverty in a short period of time. Um, but definitely, I think democratic socialism is something that in the United States we should be looking at, because if you go to Canada, you will definitely see the difference, right? That people have very different ways of thinking of old age, of having children, because there's so much protection for that in that manner. So.
And on that note, let's put our hands together for our speaker.